If someone had told me a year ago that my life, my meticulously ordered, predictably quiet life, would be appended by a burst pipe and a text message sent to the wrong number, I would have laughed. It would have been a dry, small sound, the kind of laugh that doesn't really mean amusement so much as a polite dismissal of the absurd. My life was a library of carefully shelved books, each day a replica of the last, and I was its fiercely protective, deeply solitary librarian. I didn't do absurd. I didn't do chaos. And I certainly didn't do love. My world was the 750 square feet of apartment 4B. It was my sanctuary, my fortress against a world that always felt too loud, too fast, too much. From my window, I had a perfect, oblique view of the building's small, shared courtyard and, more importantly, a clear line of sight to the door of apartment 4A. His door. Julian. He was my neighbor. He was also the building's resident paradox. A storm cloud in human form. He moved with a heavy, certain tread that seemed to shake the floorboards through our shared wall. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a collection of hard lines and solid mass that seemed to take up more space than was allotted to him. His voice, when I heard it echoing in the hallway, was a low rumble, infrequent and always sounding vaguely annoyed. For the first 6 months he lived there, we had a routine. An unspoken, unintentional dance of avoidance. If I heard his keys in the lock, I would wait an extra 30 seconds before leaving my own apartment. If I saw his silhouette through the peephole, my hand would retreat from the doorknob as if burned. He was a physical presence, a loud fact in the quiet poem of my existence, and I was, frankly, terrified of him. He was always covered in a fine layer of sawdust or a smudge of grease. His hands were large and calloused, tools of a trade I couldn't imagine. He fixed things. I heard him, sometimes, working in his own apartment. The controlled whine of a drill, the solid thud of a hammer. He was a man of action, of physical solutions. I was a man of words, of abstract theories, of problems that existed only on paper. We were different species inhabiting the same small ecosystem. I built him up in my mind. He was arrogant, I decided. Brusque. The kind of man who wouldn't have time for a quiet, anxious person like me. This narrative was my shield. It was easier to believe he was an antagonist than to confront the unsettling truth that the loathsome of his existence next door was the most compelling thing in my life. I watched him from my window, watched him haul lumber from his truck, watched the muscles in his back strain against the fabric of his t-shirt. I watched and I longed for something I was too afraid to even name. The distance was my safety. A chasm I had dug myself, wide and deep and uncrossable. Then came the water. It started as a stain. A faint, tea-colored discoloration on the ceiling of my bathroom. I watched it for 3 days, a student of its slow, amoebic growth. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it would go away. My routine was a fragile ecosystem, and a problem like this, a problem that required phone calls and strangers in my space, was a meteor poised to destroy it all. On the 4th day, the ceiling stopped staining and started dripping. A slow, fat, rhythmic plink into a strategically placed bucket. Plink. Plink. A tiny, maddening drumbeat counting down the seconds to the end of my piece. I tried to ignore it. I turned up the music. I put in earplugs. But I could still feel the vibration of each drop hitting the plastic. The inevitable happened at 2 in the morning. A sound like a muffled gunshot, followed by the roar of a waterfall. I scrambled out of bed, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. My bathroom was a disaster zone. The ceiling had given way, and water was pouring down, plaster and insulation turning to a gray slurry on my tiled floor. My carefully constructed world was literally dissolving around me. Panic, cold and sharp, seized my throat. I did the only thing I could think to do. I called the emergency number for the building superintendent. A sleepy voice grumbled, took my details, and said someone would be there as soon as possible. I waited, wrapped in a towel, shivering more from anxiety than cold, listening to the destruction of my home. 10 minutes later, a heavy fist pounded on my door. Not the superintendent. I knew that knock. I had spent months learning its specific cadence through the wall. I opened the door, and there was Julian. He filled the entire doorframe. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt and low-slung jeans, his hair a mess from sleep, his eyes narrowed and focused. He looked past me, his gaze immediately finding the source of the sound. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask if I was okay. "Main shutoff is in the basement," he rumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "I'll be right back. Don't touch any of the lights." And then he was gone, his heavy boots thudding down the hall. I was left standing in my doorway, water pooling around my feet, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. Chaos had arrived, and it had a name. Julian. He was back in minutes. The roaring stopped, replaced by the sad, steady dripping of the aftermath. He pushed past me into the apartment, his presence sucking all the air out of the room. He surveyed the damage with a critical, professional eye, his expression unreadable. "Pipe in the floor of the apartment above you," he said, finally looking at me. His eyes were a surprising shade of green, like moss in a deep forest. Up close, I could see the faint lines of exhaustion around them. "This is bad. You're going to need a full replacement. Ceiling, flooring, probably the subfloor." He spoke of my catastrophe with the detached calm of a surgeon discussing an appendix. I just nodded, unable to form words. My sanctuary was in ruins. "I'll call the super in the morning, get the go-ahead." "I can start tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "You." I managed to squeak out. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something, amusement. Annoyance, in his green eyes. "I'm a contractor. It's what I do. Cheaper for the building if I handle it." Of course. The man of physical solutions. My abstract world had crashed into his concrete one. The next few days, he explained, would be loud. They would be messy. He would be here. In my apartment. In my space. For hours on end. The chasm hadn't just been crossed, it had been obliterated by a flood. The next morning, he arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, armed with a toolbox that looked like it weighed more than I did. The quiet solitude of my apartment was shattered by the screech of a saw and the thud of a demolition hammer. Julian moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. He tore down the ruined ceiling, pulled up the warped floorboards, his body a machine of focused intent. I tried to hide in my study, tried to work. But the noise was a physical barrier against thought. More than that, his presence was a constant, humming distraction. I was acutely aware of him in the next room. I could hear the soft grunt as he lifted a heavy piece of drywall, the quiet curse when a screw stripped, the rhythmic sound of his breathing during a moment of exertion. My home, my fortress, was now his workspace. My routines were demolished along with my bathroom ceiling. I found myself just watching him. From the corner of my eye, through the doorway. Observing him in his element. It was in these stolen glances that the myth of the arrogant brute I had constructed began to crumble. I saw the intense concentration on his face as he measured a piece of pipe, his brow furrowed, his lower lip caught between his teeth. I noticed a long, thin scar that ran the length of his left forearm, a pale white line against his tanned skin. I saw the way his large, calloused hands, which I had imagined to be clumsy and rough, could be incredibly precise, gently fitting a small copper joint into place. He worked with a quiet competence that was both intimidating and deeply compelling. He didn't make small talk. For the most part, he didn't talk at all. The apartment was filled with the sounds of work, but not of conversation. The silence between us was a living thing, thick with all the words I was too afraid to say. On the third day, I forced myself to be useful. I made coffee, my hand shaking slightly as I carried a mug to him. He was bent over, inspecting the new plumbing beneath the sink. "Coffee," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy. He straightened up, turning to face me. He was smudged with dirt and sweat glistened on his temples. He looked tired. Not angry, not annoyed. Just tired. The weariness was visible in the slight slump of his broad shoulders, a vulnerability I had never imagined in him. "Thanks," he said, his voice a low gravel. He reached for the mug, and his fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing. A flicker of contact. Less than a second. But for me, it was an electric shock. A jolt of pure heat that shot up my arm and straight to my chest, where my heart kicked into a frantic, panicked rhythm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove. Did he feel it? Did he notice my reaction? His expression didn't change. He just took a long drink from the mug, his eyes closing for a moment in what looked like genuine appreciation. That's good. Thanks, Leo. He knew my name. I retreated to my study, my skin still tingling where he had touched me. My mind replayed the moment on a loop. The roughness of his skin against mine. The warmth of his hand. It was an insignificant event, a meaningless accident. But my body was reacting as if it were the most significant thing that had ever happened. My stomach was a swarm of agitated bees. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. I was a fool. An absolute, hopeless fool. Later that afternoon, the power dynamic between us shifted in a way I never could have anticipated. I heard a sharp curse from the bathroom, followed by a clatter of metal. I rushed to the doorway, my heart pounding. Julian was standing by the sink, his right hand wrapped in his left. Blood, dark and vivid, was welling up between his fingers. A utility knife lay on the floor at his feet. "Damn it," he muttered, his face pale beneath the grime. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he looked not in control. He looked human. Flawed. In pain. And in that moment, something inside me clicked into place. My anxiety, my intimidation, it all just evaporated, replaced by a clear, sharp need to help. "Sit down," I said, my voice firm and steady in a way that surprised even me. "On the edge of the tub. Let me see." He looked at me, his green eyes wide with a flicker of surprise, but he did as I asked. He sat, and I gently took his hand. The cut was deep, a clean slice across his palm. It was bleeding freely. "Stay here," I ordered, and hurried to my kitchen to grab my first aid kit. I was always prepared for small emergencies. Paper cuts, minor burns. My life was so devoid of real risk that my first aid kit was mostly for show. Until now. I came back and knelt in front of him. I poured antiseptic onto a cotton pad. "This is going to sting." He just nodded, his jaw tight. He watched me, his gaze intense, as I carefully cleaned the wound. His hand, which had seemed so large and imposing, felt strangely delicate in my own. I could feel the tremor running through it. He wasn't just a force of nature, he was a man with nerve endings, a man who could be hurt. I worked in silence, my focus absolute. I cleaned the cut, applied pressure until the bleeding slowed, and then carefully wrapped his palm in a thick layer of gauze, taping it securely. My movements were sure and steady. In this small, specific moment, I was the competent one. I was the one with the solution. When I was finished, I looked up at him. He was still watching me, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, no longer awkward, but filled with a new kind of weight. "You should have been a doctor," he said, his voice quiet. I let out a small, shaky laugh. "I get dizzy reading about paper cuts. I think I chose the right profession." He didn't smile, but the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. "Thanks, Leo," he said again. And this time, my name on his lips sounded different. It sounded intimate. He couldn't work with his hand bandaged like that. He cleaned up his tools slowly, awkwardly, using only his left hand. I watched him, a strange feeling blooming in my chest. A feeling of connection. Of shared vulnerability. He was no longer just the loud, intimidating man from 4A. He was Julian. A man with a scar on his arm and a fresh wound on his hand that I had tended. "I'll finish up tomorrow," he said, standing in the doorway, ready to leave. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't want him to go. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. The noise, the mess, the disruption, I had grown used to it. I had grown used to him. The silence that would descend when he left suddenly felt less like peace and more like a profound and aching loneliness. The next day was the last day of the major repairs. Julian worked methodically, his bandaged hand making his movements a little slower, a little more deliberate. The new ceiling was up, the walls were patched, and the new flooring was laid. By evening, my bathroom looked better than it had before the flood. All that was left was some painting and sealing, things he could finish tomorrow. He finished cleaning up just as the sky outside my window turned a deep, bruised purple. The first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the glass. Within minutes, it was a downpour, the wind howling, the rain coming down in solid sheets. A storm had rolled in, sudden and violent. "Looks like you're stuck for a bit," I said, trying to sound casual, but my heart was doing a nervous tap dance against my ribs. Julian stood by the window, watching the deluge. "Yeah. Looks like it." The air was thick with unspoken things. The job was done. The reason for his presence in my apartment was gone. Soon, the storm would pass, and he would walk across the hall to his own apartment, and the chasm between us would reform. The thought was unbearable. I could order a pizza, I offered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "As a thank you for all the work." He turned from the window and looked at me. A long, considering look. I held my breath, bracing for the rejection, for the polite excuse. "Okay," he said, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Pizza sounds good." Relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. We sat in my small living room, the pizza box on the coffee table between us, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner. The rain lashed against the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy around us. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. We ate in a comfortable silence for a while. Then, he started to talk. He told me about his work, about the satisfaction of building something real with his hands. He spoke of the frustration of dealing with clients who changed their minds every 5 minutes. He wasn't the monosyllabic grunter I had imagined. He was thoughtful. Articulate. I found myself talking, too. I told him about my research, about the medieval poetry I spent my days translating. I expected him to be bored, to tune out. But he listened. He asked questions. He seemed genuinely interested. We were just two men, talking in a dimly lit room, while a storm raged outside. And it felt more real, more right, than anything I had experienced in a very long time. Then, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at it, and the open, relaxed expression on his face vanished, replaced by a tight, hard mask. He thumbed a quick reply, his movements sharp and angry. "Everything okay?" I asked gently. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Just my ex, David, thinks I'm still the same emotionally constipated jerk I was 5 years ago. Some people never let you change." The casual mention of a male ex sent another shockwave through my system, but I pushed it down, focusing on the pain in his voice. The confident, capable man was gone, replaced by someone haunted and hurt. "He's not wrong about how I used to be," Julian continued, staring at the dark screen of his phone. "I was good at building walls. Just as good as I am at building them for other people." Before I could respond, my own phone buzzed. I picked it up. It was a text. From Julian. I frowned, confused. He was sitting 3 feet away from me. I opened the message. The text read, "You never saw me. No one does. I'm just the guy who fixes things. I'm done trying to prove I'm more than that." My blood ran cold. I looked from my phone to his. He was staring at his own screen, his eyes wide with horror. He had sent it to me. He had meant to send that raw, painful confession to his ex, but in his anger, he had sent it to the last person he'd texted with about the pizza order. He had sent it to me. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain and our ragged breathing. He had accidentally ripped open his chest and shown me the broken, bleeding thing inside. He looked utterly exposed. Mortified. He snatched his phone, his face a mess of shame and panic. "Leo, I'm so sorry. I didn't, that wasn't for you." He started to get up, to flee. "Julian, wait," I said, my voice shaking. He froze, half standing, unable to look at me. All my fear, all my years of hiding and observing from a distance, it all fell away. All I could see was his pain. The loneliness that mirrored my own, a loneliness he hid behind a wall of muscle and competence, just as I hid mine behind a wall of books and silence. I stood up and walked the few steps that separated us. I reached out and gently touched his arm. He flinched but didn't pull away. "I see you," I whispered, the words feeling more true than anything I had ever said. "I do." He finally lifted his head and looked at me. His green eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. The arrogant stranger, the competent contractor, the angry ex-boyfriend, all those versions of him were gone. In his eyes, I saw just Julian. Lonely, and afraid, and beautiful. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. But suddenly the small space between us was gone. My hand moved from his arm to his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble on his cheek. His eyes fluttered shut. And then I kissed him. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss. It was slow. Hesitant. A question. His lips were soft, yielding. For a moment, he was perfectly still, and a sliver of panic shot through me. I've made a mistake, I misread everything, but then his hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, and he was kissing me back. It was a kiss of profound and startling honesty. It was the taste of coffee and pizza and rain. It was the feeling of calloused fingers, gentle in my hair. It was a silent conversation where we confessed everything. The loneliness. The longing. The fear. In that kiss, the chasm between apartment 4A and 4B, between his world and mine, ceased to exist. We were just two men, holding on to each other in the middle of a storm, finally found. I woke to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through my window. For a blissful, disoriented moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. My body felt warm, lived in. The ghost of his lips was still on mine. The scent of him, sawdust and soap and something uniquely Julian, was on my pillows. Then my eyes opened fully. And I was alone. The bed beside me was empty. The indentation on the pillow was the only evidence he had been there at all. Panic, a familiar, cold serpent, began to uncoil in my stomach. I sat up, my heart starting its frantic, panic drumming. Maybe he was in the kitchen. Making coffee. The thought was so absurdly domestic, so hopeful, that it hurt. I slipped out of bed and padded into the living room. It was empty. The pizza box was gone, the coffee table wiped clean. My apartment was exactly as it had been before he'd arrived, only now it felt cavernous. Hollowed out. On the kitchen counter, propped against the sugar bowl, was a folded piece of paper. A note. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward it. My hand trembled as I picked it up. The writing was a rough, masculine scrawl. 2 words. I'm sorry. Sorry. The word was a punch to the gut. Sorry for what? Sorry for the kiss. Sorry for staying. Sorry for letting me see him. Sorry for it all. The ambiguity was a form of torture. It left a vacuum that my anxiety rushed to fill with the worst possible interpretations. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness fueled by a fight with his ex and the intimacy of the storm. He regretted it. He woke up in the clear light of day and was disgusted. With me. With himself. I sank onto a kitchen chair, the note clutched in my hand. The paper felt like it was burning my skin. The carefully constructed man I had become, the one who could tend a wound and initiate a kiss, crumbled into dust. I was back to being the old me. The foolish, solitary observer who got his hopes up, who dared to want something he could never have. My sanctuary, which his presence had first violated and then transformed into something warm and alive, was once again just a fortress. But now I knew what I was fortifying myself against. It wasn't the loud, chaotic world. It was the echoing silence he had left behind. The ghost of his presence was everywhere. The clean patch of ceiling in the bathroom. The faint scent on my sheets. The memory of his weight in my bed. My old solitude had been a comfortable blanket. This new solitude was a cage. Every quiet moment was filled with his absence. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was loud with the sound of him not being there. The next 2 days were a special kind of hell. I jumped at every sound in the hallway. The creak of floorboards. The click of a neighboring door. Each time, my heart would leap into my throat, a desperate, stupid hope rising in me, only to be crushed when it wasn't him. I saw him once. I was taking out the recycling, and he was coming up the stairs. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of something in his panic. Guilt, before he looked away, his jaw tight. He gave me a short, jerky nod and pushed past me, taking the stairs two at a time. He didn't say a word. That was worse than the note. The note could be misinterpreted. The averted eyes, the stony silence, the desperate flight, that was a clear and brutal message. Stay away. It meant nothing. I retreated back into my apartment, my fortress, and locked the door. I felt like a fool. I had opened myself up, just a crack, and the rejection had been swift and absolute. The walls I had built around my heart, which I had foolishly let crumble, I now began to rebuild, brick by painful brick. It was safer this way. Solitude didn't hurt like this. I tried to go back to my routine. I sat at my desk, surrounded by my books, my translations. But the words on the page were just black squiggles. The ancient poems of love and loss felt like a personal mockery. My carefully ordered world felt like a prison of my own making. I had tasted connection, real and raw and terrifying, and now everything else felt like a pale imitation of life. The silence stretched into a third day. I had resigned myself to it. I had accepted the narrative my anxiety had written. It was a mistake, he was gone, and we would go back to being strangers separated by a wall, only now the silence would be thick with the memory of a kiss and the sting of regret. That night, I was trying to read, trying to force my brain to focus on anything other than him, when I heard it. A knock on my door. Not his usual heavy, confident knock. This was hesitant. Softer. A knock, then a pause, then another, more tentative knock. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed quiet, he would go away. It would be easier. Less painful. Another knock, a little more insistent this time. Leo. His voice. Muffled through the wood, but unmistakably his. It was quiet. Uncertain. Nothing like the rumbling command I was used to. My body moved before my brain could object. I was at the door, my hand on the knob, my breath held tight in my chest. I opened it. He was standing there, looking as exhausted and wrung out as I felt. His shoulders were slumped. His hair was a mess, as if he'd been running his hands through it over and over. He wasn't looking at me, but at the floor, at his worn work boots. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I just nodded, stepping back to let him in. The moment he crossed the threshold, his scent filled the space again, and it was like a physical blow, undoing all the careful work I had done to fortify myself against him. He walked into the middle of the living room and just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked lost. "I'm an idiot," he said, finally looking up at me. His green eyes were filled with a misery that mirrored my own. What I did, leaving like that, with just that stupid note, it was cowardly. "I'm so sorry, Leo." "Why?" The word was a raw whisper. "Why did you leave?" He let out a long, shaky breath. I panicked. "I woke up next to you, Anne, and I felt. I don't know. Come. Right. And it terrified me. I haven't felt that way with anyone. Ever." He started pacing, a caged animal in my small living room. "My whole life, I've been the guy who can handle things. The one who fixes things. I know how to deal with busted pipes and broken walls. I don't know how to deal with this. With feelings." He gestured vaguely between us. "Especially not for another man. It's new territory for me. And it's scary as hell. All that stuff with David, he always said I was emotionally unavailable, that I kept him at arm's length. And he was right. Because I was scared. And when I woke up next to you, feeling the opposite of scared, feeling something real, my first instinct was to run. To build a wall. It's what I do." He stopped pacing and faced me, his expression raw and vulnerable. "These last few days, avoiding you in the hall, pretending you don't exist, it's been the hardest thing I've ever had to do. The silence was killing me. I've fixed your apartment, but mine feels broken. Because you're not in it." Every word he spoke was a balm on the raw wounds of my own fear and insecurity. He wasn't disgusted. He wasn't regretting it. He was just as scared as I was. I was scared too, I admitted, my voice finding its strength. "When you were gone, I thought it was all a mistake. that you regretted touching me. Never, he said, the word full of fierce conviction. He took a step closer to me. Leo, that night, it was the realest thing that's happened to me in a long, long time. And that wrong text, it was the truest thing I've ever written. I just sent it to the wrong person. Or, maybe, for the first time, I sent it to the right 1 inch. He was in front of me now, so close I could feel the heat coming off his body. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently cupped my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, a mirror of the gesture I had made before our first kiss. I don't want to be just the guy who fixes things anymore, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not for you. You're not, I said, leaning into his touch. You never were. And then he was kissing me again. This time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of reunion, of relief. It was desperate and deep and full of all the fear and longing of the past few days. It was a promise. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I'm not going to run again, he whispered. But you have to know. I'm new at this. I'm probably going to be clumsy. I might say the wrong thing. So will I said, a real smile spreading across my face. We can be clumsy together. He pulled back slightly, a genuine, heart-stopping smile of his own appearing. It transformed his whole face, chasing away the shadows. Okay. Yeah. I'd like that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. The familiar jangle was a comforting sound. He fumbled with the ring for a moment, his large fingers surprisingly deft, and separated a single, shiny new key. He held it out to me in the palm of his hand. It was a simple, silver key. What's this? I asked, my voice thick. It's a spare, he said, his gaze steady and serious. For my place. In case, you know. You ever wanted to just come over. Without knocking. Or in case you wanted to stay, and I had to leave early for a job. It's yours. If you want it. It was so much more than a key. It was an invitation. A symbol of trust. It was him taking a sledgehammer to the last remaining wall between us. It was a tangible promise for a future. I reached out and took the key from his palm. Its metal was cool against my skin. I closed my fingers around it, the serrated edges digging into my skin. A grounding sensation. This was real. I want it, I said. I want it very much. His smile widened, and he wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in his scent, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against my chest. The fortress had fallen. The chasm was bridged. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. The morning after that was different. I woke slowly, cocooned in warmth. Julian's arm was slung heavily over my waist, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my back. The pale morning light crept into the room, and this time, it didn't bring panic. It brought a quiet, profound sense of peace. He was still here. He hadn't run. I lay there for a long time, just feeling the solid weight of him against me, listening to the sound of him breathing. This was the domesticity I had dreamed of, the simple intimacy that had felt so impossibly out of reach. It was real. He stirred, his grip on me tightening for a moment before he mumbled something incoherent and burrowed his face into my shoulder. A small smile touched my lips. The formidable, intimidating contractor from 4A was, it turned out, a world-class snuggler. Later, we stood in his kitchen. It was the polar opposite of mine. Mine was sterile, minimalist, everything in its precise place. His was a space of chaotic creation. Blueprints were spread across the large wooden table, mugs were left on the counter, and a fine layer of sawdust seemed to cover everything. But it was warm. It was lived in. It was his. He made coffee, moving with a familiar, comfortable ease in his own space. I leaned against the counter, watching him. The way he measured the grounds with intense focus, the same focus he'd had when measuring pipes in my bathroom. He handed me a mug, and our fingers brushed. This time, there was no jolt of panic. Just a pleasant, familiar spark. A quiet thrill. So, he said, leaning against the counter opposite me, his hip brushing mine. Medieval poetry, huh? What's that all about? And so I told him. I told him about heroic epics and courtly love, about rhymes and meters that had survived for centuries. And he listened, really listened, asking questions, a look of genuine curiosity in his moss-green eyes. And he told me about the house he was building from the ground up out in the country, about the challenges of working with reclaimed wood, about the satisfaction of seeing something he'd designed in his head become a solid, physical reality. We were learning the rhythm of each other's lives, the shape of each other's worlds. And we found, to our mutual surprise, that they weren't so different after all. We were both builders. He built with wood and stone, and I built with words and ideas. We both craved order and found beauty in structure. The days turned into weeks. The key to his apartment felt heavy and significant in my pocket. I used it one afternoon when I knew he was home, letting myself in without knocking. I found him on his couch, fast asleep, exhausted from a long day. I didn't wake him. I just pulled a blanket over him and sat in the armchair across from him, reading a book, content to just share the same quiet space. He started leaving things at my apartment. A toothbrush in my bathroom. A pair of worn work boots by the door. His favorite coffee mug, which was chipped at the rim. Each item was a small anchor, a quiet declaration that he belonged here, too. My apartment, once a fortress of solitude, was becoming a shared home. A sanctuary for two. I think back now to the man I was before the flood. The quiet observer, hiding behind his books, terrified of the loud man next door. I had built my life around the avoidance of risk, the worship of routine. My world was safe, and predictable, and crushingly lonely. Julian was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the chaos that broke down my walls, literally and figuratively. He was a storm that I thought would destroy me, but instead, he washed away the dust and the fear, leaving behind something clean and new and real. That misdirected text message, a moment of accidental, raw vulnerability, was the truest note I had ever received. It was a crack in his armor that let me see the man inside, a man who was just as lonely and just as longing for connection as I was. Life is not a carefully shelved library. It's messy and unpredictable, and sometimes a pipe bursts in the middle of the night. Sometimes you fall in love with the person you were most afraid of. Sometimes, the most terrifying risks lead to the most profound peace. This morning, I woke up in his arms again. He was already awake, watching me, a soft, sleepy smile on his face. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss that tasted of coffee and the promise of 1,000 more mornings just like this one. In the quiet intimacy of the dawn, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my solitary life was over. The story of me had become the story of us. And it was a much, much better story.